Okay, Itaniko Enki. Hello, my name is Singer, or at least that's what my name means in Blackfoot, Enki, Singer. But my government name is Grant Manyheads, and I'm one of the interpreters here at Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park. And today we're going to be talking about Blackfoot history. And in particular, we're going to be talking about some aspects of the fur trade that came to the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples through the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company back in the late 1600s. But before we actually get into it, let's talk a little bit about the Siksikaitsitapi, or the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples. Now, on the screen there, you can see an image, and this image is the modern day symbol for the Blackfoot Confederacy, or more properly, the Siksikaitsitapi. Now, Siksikaitsitapi in the Blackfoot language means Blackfoot Speaking Peoples, so it really is more accurate. And here we have 4 tribes that make up the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples. And if you can see that image, we actually have the 4 tribes today. 3 of these tribes exist in what we call Canada today, and one of the tribes actually exists in the United States of America. The 3 tribes that exist up here in Canada are the Piikani, or we would say Skinny Piikani, or Apatusi Piikani. That kind of means those Blackfoot, or those Piikani who are living behind us, kind of near the mountains. So that's just 1/4 of the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples. If we look at the next image, we see the other tribe, and that's where we are right now, the Siksika. Now the Siksika, or Siksika in English, actually means Blackfoot. And so that's the tribe that the Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park is situated on, Siksika. So that's one of the emblems, and that's actually our flag right there. So let's move on to the next image, and here we see our sister tribe, the Akena, or sometimes they're better known as the Blood Tribe, but in the Blackfoot language, Akena means many leaders or many chiefs. So this is also a sister tribe. The next image we have is of the Amskapi Piikani, and these are the Blackfoot living in the United States of America. Particularly, they're Piikani. Amskapi in our language means across. So in this sense, we're talking about across the border. So these are the Blackfoot living across the border in what they call the United States of America now. So altogether, these 4 tribes make up the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples, or the Siksikaitsitapi. And so here we can see them, the Kena, Siksika, Piikani, and Amskapi Piikani. Now, if you want to talk about the Confederacy, well, then you'd have to add the Tsuut'ina people to this list of tribes, because the Confederacy was more of a military alliance. And so these 4 tribes, including the Tsuut'ina people, were all allied together militarily. And at one time, the Grovin, or Arapaho people, were also allied with the Blackfoot. But let's actually move on to the next image. Okay, now here we have a picture of Ini. Now, Ini in Blackfoot means the Plains Bison, or the Plains Buffalo. And the Plains Bison was actually our staff of life as Siksikaitsitapi. And so this provided our food, our clothing, our shelter, among hundreds of other uses. So let's look at the next image. So here we have Ini in herds. Now, a herd of buffalo, we would say Iniksi, or a buffalo herd. And so, as I mentioned, this animal provided our food, our shelter, and our winter clothing and winter bedding. But when it came to our day-to-day wear, we'd use lighter pelts such as deer and antelope for our day-to-day clothes. So I also want to point out that the buffalo not just provided our food and clothing and shelter, but like I mentioned, there was hundreds of other uses that we had for this animal. So truly, he was our staff of life. So let's look at the next image. Here we have more pictures of the Ini, and particularly in the northern climate. Now, so wherever these great northern herds roamed, our people, meaning the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples, we followed them. And so our land wasn't defined by the Blackfoot people, it was defined by Ini, by the buffalo. So our homeland we called kitawas, meaning our homeland. And so, as I mentioned, our homeland was defined by the buffalo or the bison. If we move on to the next image, we talk a little bit about the dog days. Now, for most of the existence of the Blackfoot speaking peoples, right up until the 17th century, our people were living in the literal dog days. There's an expression, I think it's kitawahsinoon imitegs, which roughly translates to in the time when we used dogs to move camp. And this is the time period we're speaking of. Now, in this time, our people walked from place to place. So the most we probably walk in a day would be 3 to 5 miles. And so long as we could see the buffalo, we were content. So long as we could see this animal, we were content. No matter where it went, we'd follow it. And that being said, we'd have to be able to make camp and break camp just as quickly when we're following this animal. Sometimes you'd have no choice but to continually walking day after day to keep the herds in sight. But so long as we could see the buffalo, our people were content. And this goes back to the days when we were using the dog as our beast of burden. So let's look at the next image. Now this is a kitawahsinoon, our homeland, and this is just one of the maps of our homeland. So you can kind of notice there from the Rocky Mountains, or in our language we would say mistakists, from the backbone of the earth all the way east, almost out to Manitoba, all the way east to the Touchwood Hills and Qu'Appelle Valley and Nut Mountain up near Prince Albert. Well, that's how far the Blackfoot lands used to extend eastward, almost to the Manitoba Escarpment. And then from as far north as the North Saskatchewan River, where present-day Rocky Mountain House, Edmonton, Prince Albert are situated, from that particular river all the way south down to the Yellowstone River in the United States of America, the state of Montana. You could see the cities of Bozeman, Butte, Billings. Well, this vast area in between, this was kitawahsinoon, our homeland. And so that's a very, very huge area. And so when our people lived in this area, we had people who were living right in the Alpine, right in the mountains, even on the west slope of the Rocky Mountains. And then also we had people who were living in the foothills, the sheltered river valleys, all along the western part of our lands. And then most of the lands eastward were all plains. So our people were used to living in all of these different geographic areas. So let's move on to the next image. Now here we have another map of the Blackfoot lands, or our homeland, kitawahsinoon. And here we have, you can kind of see the trading posts up top there when we started to first trade with the trading companies. But we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But let's move on to the next image. Now, so long as our people were following the buffalo, we were content. And like I mentioned, at first, when our people traveled all over those vast lands that you were looking at, our people did it on foot. For literally all of our existence up until the 17th century, all that vast land on those maps that you were looking at, our people traveled all over those lands on foot. So we got to know our lands intimately. We knew where to forage for certain plants, for medicines. We also knew where the cycles of the buffalo. We also knew where to forage for our foods, such as prairie turnip and such. So at first, we were a people without horses, and that's the reason why we got to know our land so intimately, is because we walked all over it. And then in time, once we got the horse, then we just traveled that much faster over our homeland. But this was all from the time when we still used the dog as our beast of burden. Let's move on to the next image. So here we can have some of our people, like I mentioned, walking all over our lands. And here we have dogs, which are closer to wolves, actually, than they were to any other breed. And so our dogs are a lot bigger than. They could drag 80 to 100 pounds over the prairies. So let's move to the next image. Now, this dog days, it basically ended when this animal was introduced to the Blackfoot speaking peoples. Now, most of the world knows this animal as the horse, But to the Blackfoot speaking peoples, when we first met this animal, we had no idea what to call it. All we knew was that it was as big as an elk, which in my language you would say punuka, and it was as helpful as a dog. In my language we would say imita. So we put the two words together, punukomita. And punukomita actually means elk dog. And that's how most Blackfoot refer to this particular animal to this day, the animal that you know as the horse. Well, when this animal was introduced to us, that was a fundamental change in millennia old routine. Like I mentioned, our people are used to living in the dog days for literally all of our existence up until the 17th century. And then now, all of a sudden, this huge, beautiful animal appears to us. And our mothers and our grandmothers adapted the use of this animal the same way we use the dog. We now began to use our horse in the same manner. So let's actually look at the next image. Now, right on the heels of the horse, 17th century, came the trade goods. Now, when the trade goods first came to us, they actually came to us through the middlemen in trade, and that would have been the Cree and the Assiniboine. Now, things I kind of want to explain something. To the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, in our ancient stories, we have, lack of a better word, deity, and that person's name is Napi. Now, Napi wasn't necessarily an evil person or an evil spirit. What he was a person who did things in the extreme. So when the mothers and grandmothers told us Napi stories, basically it was, don't do what Napi did, because he does things in the extreme. Now, long before any Blackfoot ever met any Europeans, we already had an idea of what Napi looked like. And the story is Napi had bright white clothes, like his war shirt and his leggings and his breechcloth and his moccasins were all bright white. Even his hair was apparently light, and his skin was light. And apparently he had eyes that were colored like the rainbow or like flashing thunder. But Napi was this person, and this is how every Blackfoot would have known he looked like. Now the thing is, when we first started receiving trade goods, and we knew that they were coming from people who looked like Napi, then that name kind of stood. And instead of calling a person Napi, they would have seen all the people that were trading, and they would have all had maybe blonde hair and blue eyes or green eyes. And so our people began to call them Napi's people. Not just because of how they looked, and in our language we'd say Napiquans. We start calling the white man or the European Napiquans, not just because of how they look, but also because of what they came with. And that's what we see pictured here, trade goods. Now these trade goods made life a lot easier for our people. In fact, as an example, in the dog days, we would use boiling pits to boil whatever it is that we needed to boil. And that process took about 6 hours just to boil something. Now all of a sudden we're receiving pots, pans, kettles from the middlemen in trade, from the Europeans. And now all we have to do is fill that pot with water, put it over a fire, and then what took half a day to boil now only takes you 8 minutes. And so this made life a lot easier for our people. Same with the trade cloth. Most of our clothes were made with pelts and with hides, and you need a lot of hand strength, and you need hand strength to be able to bind it and put it all together to make clothes and such. Well, now we had wool, and this wool came with scissors, threads, needles, thimbles, etc. And then we could cut our own patterns, and then our mothers and grandmothers could make patterns and make clothes for their children, for their husbands, for their family members, to keep them warm. And so these trade goods made life a lot easier for the Blackfoot speaking peoples. And when these trade goods came to the Blackfoot people, the people bringing them were usually popular. They were usually people we wanted to receive. So back then, when the horse came, the trade goods were right on its heels. So these are big factors that affected the Blackfoot speaking peoples and made a big change in our lives. So let's actually look at the next image. Now, the traders, when they first came here, especially the Hudson Bay Company, well, in 1670, King Charles II of England, he granted a royal charter to create the Hudson's Bay Company. And this was under the governorship of his cousin, who was the was Prince Rupert of the Rhine, hence Rupert's Land. So all of these lands became known as Rupert's Land. So every river, anything that drained into the Hudson's Bay, all those lands are what they considered Rupert's Land. Now this was all unbeknownst to the Blackfoot. We had no idea that in 1670 King Charles made this sort of agreement with his cousin. All we knew was that all we know is that the lands that we were living on at that time were already sort of sold. Even though those people weren't here, they sold those lands and they made these deals thousands and thousands of miles away from where we actually were. So the charter applied to all the lands, like I mentioned, that drained into the Hudson's Bay. And so if you look at this particular map, you can kind of see all of those lands that drain into the Hudson's Bay. And this, hence, is what they considered Rupert's Land. And Rupert's Land was owned by the Hudson Bay Company, 1670. So let's actually look at the next image. Now, at first, like I mentioned, when we start to receive these trade goods, we were getting them from the Cree and the Assiniboine. They were the middlemen in the trade. So from about 1680 to about 1786, this is how the Blackfoot received our trade goods. We received them through the Cree and through the Assiniboine middlemen. And more often than not, these goods that we received were all second-hand goods. Now, the Cree and the Assiniboine would sell the Blackfoot and other prairie tribes these items, maybe 2 or 3 years after they had purchased them. And then they usually charged the prairie tribes three times the amount that they paid for them. So this was very lucrative for the Cree and the Assiniboine middlemen trade. And they were applying this trade for literally 100 years. They were 100 years they were applying this trade. And they got very wealthy off of it. And, you know, because of this trade, a lot of those Cree tribes and Assiniboine tribes actually stopped trapping. They stopped trying to catch the furs, and what they would do is they would bring the trade goods and get the furs from those tribes like the Blackfoot, the Dene, and then they would in turn trade it with the Hudson Bay Company traders. Well, this trade went on for a long time, and in fact, the Blackfoot people, knowing that these Cree and Assiniboine traders were coming onto our lands with these trade goods, which we desired, we were more often than not very anxious to receive them. We wanted them to come into our camps. We befriended them. And during this time period, these tribes got to know the Blackfoot lands very, very well because they kind of preceded the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company. So before they actually set up any of their forts, these natives were actually dealing with those native tribes like the Blackfoot before the traders came out this way. And so during this time period, there was a lot of peace. There was a lot of talking, and there was a lot of peace between the Blackfoot speaking tribes and these newcomers. But then it's not to say that as early as 1790 or 1690, right up until about the early decade of the 17th century, 1707, that there already were conflicts between the middlemen in trade and the Blackfoot speaking tribes. We know this from history records from the traders who were saying that as early as 1707 that there was literally 200 teepees of Assiniboine and Cree who were wiped out by the Muscotay tribes, and these would have been all those tribes that were living between the two Saskatchewans. And of course the Blackfoot were one of these tribes. So already during this early part of the Blackfoot history, especially regarding the middleman trade and the fur trade, there was already a lot of conflict that was beginning to happen. And we weren't even competing with the Cree yet at this time. So actually let's move on to the next image. So now we're going to be talking about the fur trade, the Blackfoot. So it's interesting to note that we should point out that when the first Napequans, or the first quote-unquote white people, started to trade with the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, well, their companies were already in a bitter rivalry with each other. The Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company. Both of these companies were trying to get as many furs as they could from those tribes west of Manitoba, because they had already depleted most of those fur-bearing mammals in eastern parts of what they call Canada today. And so that's all because of this fur trade. So let's actually move on to the next image. Now, in during this fur trade, there's two major rivals, and that was the Hudson's Bay Company, and they were established in England in 1670. And they were competing with Montreal-based Northwest Company. And so both these companies were sending fur traders out into onto native lands. And for the most part, the British stayed at York Factory on the Hudson's Bay for almost 100 years before they actually moved inland. The French were already active moving westward by that time. So let's actually look at the next image. Okay, so the fur trade. Well, what is the fur trade all about? It was to see which company could get the most beaver pelts and other furs for fashion conscious, I can't even say that word, I'm sorry, fashion conscious Europe. Anyways, that's what the fur trade was. It was the fashion industry in Europe. And what they wanted was what you see just off to the side there, that beaver pelt. This is what they're all buying for, because the beaver pelt was waterproof, it lasted a long time, and it was also a symbol of wealth. Let's look at the next image. Okay, so here's a beaver pelt. This is how they would usually want the furs before they would take them in, the British and the French. Let's look at the next image. Okay, so here we have some hats. Now this is what some of the beaver fur went to. They went to these hats that all a part of the social standing in Europe. So if you had any number of these types of hats, that would distinguish you as rich or well off, or a nobleman, etc., things like that. So this was a status symbol, wearing the beaver in Europe at that time, all to do with the fashion industry. But this is what the fur companies were here in North America doing, was trying to get as many of these furs as they possibly can. Let's go to the next image. Let's go to the next image from here, the Hudson's Bay Company. So it's just kind of interesting to know, like the Hudson's Bay Company trade, they set up shop in 1670. And for the first 100 years, interestingly enough, they did not use liquor in the trade, in their trade with the native tribes. But rather, they only imported enough alcohol to meet the needs of their officers, their soldiers, their own men. And so, as you can kind of notice there, that as early as 1770, they only imported 250 gallons of liquor to York Factory. And so that kind of tells you that for that first 100 years, liquor was not a big factor in trade. And then at the same time, you have to understand that the British stayed at that York Factory for that length of time, 100 years, with very rarely venturing inland to visit any other native tribes. Rather, they kind of dealt with the native tribes that they were dealing with, the middlemen in trade, the Cree and the Assiniboine, and they counted on them to bring in all of the furs that they needed for the fur trade in Europe. So for this first 100 years, it's interesting to note that they did not use any alcohol. Now that changed when they came into competition with the Northwest Company. Now let's move on to the next image. Well, here we have the Northwest Company. As I mentioned, these people were established around 1770 by the French and by the Highland Scots. Now these people had formed a partnership. The Highland Scots led the companies, but they hired a lot of coureurs de bois, or French voyageurs, when it came to doing the actual trading. And so the Northwest Company were basically dealing in liquor for decades before their rivalry with the Hudson Bay Company. And this was how they would open trade with the native tribes, usually by giving a gift of alcohol. And then very rarely did they sell alcohol to them, but they gave the gifts of alcohol just to kind of open trade with. So let's actually look at the next image. Now, like I mentioned, the Quebec traders were also known as Nor'westers. And then these were descendants of the French voyageurs and coureurs de bois, as I mentioned, who had been trading with native tribes in that part of North America for generations. For literally generations, the French were trading with liquor with the native tribes before the British ever did. So let's actually look at the next image. So here we have the Northwest Company. And so, as I mentioned, the Northwest Company was managed primarily by Highland Scots, but they had a lot of Frenchmen working in the canoes and working in the actual fur trade itself. Now in 1787, David Thompson, who by the way was a turncoat, he worked for both the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, whoever gave him the better deal, I guess. Well, in 1787, David Thompson spent the winter with the Piikani. And then when that happened, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company established friendly trading relations with the Blackfoot. So, as I mentioned, Thompson worked for both of these companies. And what's interesting is in 1787 is when Manchester House was first built, and that's when the Blackfoot first traded with Europeans face to face on a regular basis. And it's that same year that David Thompson came out to the Alberta area of Blackfoot country today, and he stayed with the Piikani and established those friendly trade relations with Blackfoot speaking peoples. Now let's look at the next image. Now, kind of like I mentioned, the Northwest Company, when they first set up shop and they started competing with the Hudson's Bay Company, they actually had the advantage because they were using alcohol in their trade. Either they used liquor to entice the natives to come to the forts to trade, or they actually sold amounts of liquor to the native people as part of the trade. So because of this use of alcohol, they were getting furs and better dealings with the natives before the Hudson Bay Company did. And that kind of changed the game when the Hudson Bay Company sort of figured this out. Because let's look at the next image. Now, remember in that a couple of images earlier, they talked about the Hudson Bay Company trade. And from 1770 right up until 1870, or sorry, let me get that right. From 1670 right up until about 1770, about 100 years, the Hudson's Bay Company wasn't using alcohol to entice trade or as an item of trade. And in fact, for that first 100 years, they only imported 250 gallons of liquor. Well, that changed. So by 1785, they were starting to bring in more than 2,000 gallons of liquor to York Factory. And this is not even including what they were able to produce with their own still. Even with what they were able to produce with their own still, they still had to import up to 2,000 gallons of liquor a year just to be able to compete with the Northwest Company. And so this is when the liquor, when it came to trade, really exploded, because both sides were now using liquor to get the tribes to trade with their respective companies. Now let's actually move on to the next image. So it wasn't until 1786 that Manchester House was established. It was a Hudson Bay Company post on the North Saskatchewan River. Now when they set up Manchester House, this effectively ended the middleman trade that the Cree and the Assiniboine were enjoying for almost like 100 years or so. Now when Manchester House was established, now the Blackfoot, for the first time, this is right on the edge of our territory, we could trade with the traders face to face, and we didn't need any middlemen in that trade. And so when we began to face-to-face trade with the Hudson Bay Company, well then we were able to start getting more firearms, more ammunition, and liquor, unfortunately. All these items became more readily available to the Blackfoot speaking peoples. And like I mentioned, once this ended that middleman trade, well then now those same natives who had been enjoying that middleman trade now began to compete with the Blackfoot. And this is when conflict kind of started to take off. More conflict, I should say, as opposed to, let's say, in the days before the traders and the horse. So let's move on to the next image. Now here we can see the route of the Hudson Bay Company, obviously coming from the Hudson's Bay, and you can see their trade routes going through that part of Western Canada as they know it today. So over the next few years, after David Thompson met with the Hudson Bay Company, or David Thompson met with the Blackfoot, well then this kind of opened the door to trade, because this allowed the fur traders to move farther and farther west, eventually opening Fort Edmonton in 1794, and then Rocky Mountain House in 1799. So by 1799, the traders had effectively made their way all the way across the prairies right to the Rocky Mountains. And at this time, they had not gone over the Rocky Mountains yet, but they did make it all the way to the Rockies at that time. So the Hudson Bay Company came in from the York factory, sort of from the northwest onto Blackfoot lands. And then the French, they actually came to us way farther east. And let's take a look at that next image. Now here we have the Northwest Company trade route. Now here you can see them coming from Montreal. So they made their way all the way up the St. Lawrence, all the way to the Great Lakes. And then from the Great Lakes, from different posts, they made their way to Lake Winnipeg in present day Manitoba. So from there, this is where the French made their way, kind of following the same routes as the Hudson Bay Company, setting up along their forts. But here, this is the route that the French made their way into Blackfoot country, into kitawahsinoon. So these were the two companies that were competing with one another early in the trade history of the Blackfoot speaking peoples. So let's take a look at the next image. So once the traders reached kitawahsinoon, our land, our homeland as Blackfoot speaking peoples, and established their posts, well, this is, like I mentioned, when the Siksikaitsitapi acquired a regular supply of guns, ammo, and alcohol. And at this time, that's when the middleman trade was essentially eliminated. It ended at this time, once the traders reached the Blackfoot lands. Let's look at the next image. And so, an interesting note is, these fur trade posts, our people, the Siksikaitsitapi, benefited from these trade posts and from the trade goods that were offered. And that was because these forts were just beyond our hunting grounds. They're on our northern boundary, right on the North Saskatchewan River. So these forts, these people that were living on the forts, they had very little effect on our day-to-day lives as Blackfoot speaking peoples. So that kind of meant that our people were able to retain control over our lands, and we didn't have this disruption in our way of life, because we're living pretty much the same way we did before the Europeans came to visit us. So our people, we were still very much independent at that time, even with the fur trades right on our northern border. So let's take a look at the next image. Now here you can kind of see a map of kitawahsinoon, our homeland, and there in the North Saskatchewan you can actually see all the different Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company posts, starting from around present-day Prince Albert all the way to the Rocky Mountains. Well, as each of these posts was set up, usually there was a tribe, a Cree or Assiniboine, who would also be camped around these particular posts. And this is kind of how they moved into our country as well. They preceded the settlers, and as the settlers set up their forts, they usually set up their communities or their camps around the forts. And so this is how the Blackfoot kind of knew these tribes and these peoples. And like I like to mention too, because the middleman trade was ended, these tribes, a lot of conflict started to develop. After the middleman trade ended, we had reason for conflict, but after 1821, which was the year that there was a merger between the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, and when they merged, they became the new Hudson Bay Company, and they basically fired all the Métis and Cree who were helping them in this fur trade. And so now these tribes began to compete with the Blackfoot in feeding the fur traders. So we became competitive with one another. And this is when warfare really increased amongst the tribes, particularly between the Blackfoot Confederacy and the Iron Confederacy tribes. So let's actually move on to the next image. Now I just kind of wanted to point that out, and we'll talk about that more in some of the future episodes we have on the fur trade. But the fur trade there, you can kind of see the Cree and the Assiniboine, when they started to trade with the tribes, they were kind of moving to the northwest. But that's sort of stopped around the 18th century. And then by 1784, this had actually stopped. They're moving north. And in that year, that was because of smallpox. Now, smallpox hit the Cree and the Assiniboine, and that greatly reduced their military capacity. They lost a lot of people. And so at that time, because of their numbers, they were kind of forced back from the lands that they had taken from the Chippewa, and they moved back to their borders before then. So if we look at this next image, you can kind of see those lands there. Now, sorry, excuse me. You can see where the Chippewa are just north of the Cree on that map. Well, when the Cree began to withdraw from the Chippewa lands that they had taken earlier, when they had first started their kind of invasion into the west, the Cree were held in the late 70s. The Cree lands that were held in the 1770s were back under the control of the rightful owners, the Chippewa groups. Now, because of this, that Cree and Assiniboine movement going northward, it stopped, and then it actually changed and went southward. And this is when the conflict between the Blackfoot Speaking Peoples and the Cree and the Assiniboine tribes, this is when it really took off. So let's look at the next image. So like I mentioned, once they kind of left the northern limits, the territory, the Cree turned towards the parklands, which is basically those lands along the North Saskatchewan River, and then where the buffalo lived. So the Cree, they turned southward, and then they began to push vigorously onto the grasslands and the parklands located south of the North Saskatchewan River. And when this happened, that's when this great conflict happened between the Blackfoot and the Cree and Assiniboine, all particularly in the Saskatchewan region. Because up until this time, around 1795, after the Manchester House was set up, as the tribes moved westward, they came into where the Groven, Blackfoot allies, were living. And then over a period of time, the Blackfoot allies, the Groven and the Cree, they were kind of at a stalemate. They didn't trust one another, but they lived in the same area for the longest time. And then the Cree actually wiped out a small group of the Groven, and that forced the Groven to move southward towards the Milk River. And while all of this is happening, you have to understand that the Blackfoot are actually getting hit with our first measles epidemic coming from those same parts. So in 1780, that measles epidemic killed thousands and thousands and thousands of Blackfoot, particularly Siksikaitsitapi, those tribes living in eastern parts. And now because of this lack of Blackfoot population due to disease, and because the Grovens were driven out of their homelands by enemy tribes, well then that meant that the Blackfoot speaking peoples kind of lost their foothold in that part of the country, because now the Cree and the Assiniboine were moving into former Blackfoot lands and Groven lands where the Groven used to live. So this is kind of what happened in that time period, around 1780. Even though we were starting to enjoy this one-on-one trade, our enemies actually took over a lot of our former friends, became our enemies, took over some of those lands in Saskatchewan. And that's kind of basically what happened over the 1780 to the 20 years later. So let's look at the next image. So like I mentioned, in 1793, this is actually when the Groven were almost exterminated from that part of the North Saskatchewan, and they made their move to the Milk River. But this is actually our last slide, and so we're going to end the program today here. I invite you to come tune in on some other programs we have for the coming weeks, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the fur trade, talk a little bit more about the warfare and how things got worse after 1821 with the Hudson Bay Company merger with Northwest Company. And then we'll also talk about the American fur trade, because that didn't happen until 1831. So that was actually 10 years after the Hudson Bay Company merger. Then they became the new rivals of the Hudson Bay Company, and then almost all of this started all over again. But we'll talk more about that in the episodes to come. In the meantime, I want all of you who are tuning in to remember that you could write into Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park for any questions that you may have, that you want some further clarification, or if there's even things that you would like us to teach during these webinars, please send in your comments, and we'll definitely look at your suggestions. So with that, we're going to end today's program, and we'll invite you back next week with a new episode. And in the meantime, take care of one another out there. Remember, COVID still out there. Thank you. Okay.